Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 30th of September, where we are transitioning from Frankenstein to Edgar Allan Poe, and also talking about some upcoming writing assignments. So we pretty much put some closure to Frankenstein, and one of the last things I wanted to say about Frankenstein was this idea of monstrosity and how Hollywood has conditioned us to think of the creature as the monster. And as I've indicated so many times, the creature is not the monster. Victor himself is the monster, and humanity as a whole. And that I think it's unfortunate that we tend to think of the creature as the monstrosity. And even the title of the text itself, Frankenstein, is not the creature's name. The creature is always unnamed. Instead, the title Frankenstein is the creator. And Victor is monstrous and trying to basically outwit death, and also by negating his responsibility. And humanity is monstrous by rejecting this incredibly intelligent and kind creature, at least in the beginning of its creation, purely because of its appearance. And I had indicated that some of the modern day parallels with some of the isms we experience in society, racism, classism, sexism, ageism, again, oftentimes are propelled by the same motivations, exterior appearances, rather than interior individuality. But in relation to Frankenstein, I'm hopeful that by this point you are able to submit in your journal, and that you would have already done that on Monday the 28th at midnight. Though if any of you needed additional time, you could always ask me. I'd be happy to grant it. Some of you handed in your journals early. Thank you very much. I'm going through the process of evaluating those journals, and will return them back to you over the next several days. I'm evaluating them informally, so it's a checkmark system. And I'm interested to hear some of the thoughts or questions you might have had about the text Frankenstein. Approximately a page or so, but as long or as short as you'd want it to be. And perhaps you might decide that eventually you would want to do some more in-depth analysis on Frankenstein. Perhaps you might want to devote an academic paper to Frankenstein. And our first paper isn't going to be due for quite a while. It won't be due until the mid part of the semester. But I've already put up some suggested paper topics, so as we go through the text, you've got some ideas of at least general themes you could pursue. But ultimately, coming up with the specific thesis is going to be one of your challenges. And then secondly, I am today putting up some information about how to write a paper, and all of that information can be found in the upper folder that's entitled Syllabus and Other Documents. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about writing papers, as well as transition us over to Edgar Allan Poe, who happens to be our next author in our section on Gothic literature. And you'll remember that when we began the semester, H.P. Lovecraft had some thoughts about Poe. H.P. Lovecraft very much thought highly of Poe and tried to mimic Poe's style in his own writing, which we will see when we get to some of H.P. Lovecraft's short stories. But H.P. Lovecraft, just to refresh your memory, and you can see this in our notes of the video, below the video, that H.P. Lovecraft detailed Poe as being a vivid and detached chronicler of strangeness and gloom of the human mind. And I think we can definitely see that in just the 4 short stories that I selected. Obviously, Poe's canon is much larger than that, but I thought these 4 would give us a little bit of an overview. And also a chance to catch our breath a little bit before we go into our next major text, which happens to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I'll talk about in a few moments. But at any rate, Lovecraft talked about how Poe was responsible for creating the short story's maintenance of a single mood and impression. In fact, crediting Poe with creating the short story in the way we think of it today. And definitely a short story is a very different kind of genre than a novel, or even a novella, which is in between a novel and a short story. Longer than a short story, but not quite as long as a novel, which we will see with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Obviously, Poe has credits in a lot of different genres. You are probably familiar with his poetry, specifically the poem The Raven, which happens to be a favorite during Halloween. He also is credited with the detective story, or the modern detective story in the way that we think of it today. With many of his stories examining abnormal psychology. That's one of the ways that Lovecraft thought that Poe was superior, because of his understanding of the human psyche. And, of course, some stories that work with supernatural horror, which happens to be the focus of this particular class. In fact, Lovecraft went so far to say that Poe created the modern horror story in its final perfected state, at least up until the time that Lovecraft was alive, of course. So just a little bit of background about Edgar Allan Poe. He had a good many drug and alcohol issues. There are all kinds of stories about how he died alone and penniless in the gutter. There were some rather recent stories in the last decade or so talking about that what he really died of was rabies. Regardless of how he died, he had a very troubled life. He married his 13-year-old cousin, and I believe I had mentioned in Frankenstein that it wouldn't have been that unusual for cousins to marry. So when Victor and Elizabeth, who aren't blood cousins, even though they call each other cousins, are going to marry, it wouldn't necessarily have raised an eyebrow. And even the idea of a blood cousin would not be as unusual as it is today. One of Poe's greatest fears was of being buried alive, which was an actual possibility during Poe's time. Science and medicine was not as advanced as it is today. And even today, you will hear the odd story about someone who was declared dead and then found out afterwards, oftentimes in a morgue, that they are very much alive. But this would have been much more common during Poe's time, so much so that corpses were oftentimes buried with a string tied to the toe, and that string would go all the way up to the top of the soil from where that body was buried. And at the ending of that string, at the top of the soil, would be a bell, so that if it turns out that the corpse had been prematurely buried and began to move, you would hear the bell ring. So probably Poe is best known for what most Gothic writers are best known for, the understanding the fear of the unknown and trying to articulate that. The 4 stories that I selected, and there were quite a few to choose from: The Fall of the House of Usher, and I've given a link to that in the event that you don't have the Edgar Allan Poe text, but there are lots of places where you can find it online. That's the longest of the short stories, and I suspect perhaps the most challenging of the 4. The Mask of Red Death, and this will be a very interesting story when we start talking a little bit about how modern authors like Stephen King could have been influenced by Edgar Allan Poe's writing. The Telltale Heart, and finally The Black Cat. And oftentimes these are stories that are studied at the high school or even junior high school level. Poe tends to be a favorite of students, and I think one of the reasons why is, well, first, his texts are fairly short if we're concentrating on the short story genre. Secondly, they're rather gruesome and macabre, so that appeals to the sense of the child or adolescent wanting to delve into the forbidden. But they aren't at the level of, quote, gross out, unquote, that Stephen King had talked about. So we don't get that kind of explicit detail, so perhaps they're more appropriate for younger audiences than other texts would happen to be. So what I thought we would do next class is that we would talk about these 4 short stories by Poe. So if you haven't read them, you would have an opportunity to read them. Journal number 2, which is going to be on Edgar Allan Poe, will be due approximately the 7th of October, which is a Wednesday. So by that point, you should have had journal number 1 returned back to you with my commentary, so that you can get an idea of what the journal assignment is like before you start handing in other journals. And you'll be doing a journal for all the major texts that we're reading. And then also on the 7th, we will begin with our novella, as I had indicated, of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's certainly longer than a short story, so it'll be longer than Poe's text, but it won't be as long as a novel. It won't be as long as Frankenstein. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is also one of those iconic Gothic stories though perhaps it is not as iconic as Frankenstein and Dracula. Dracula is what's coming after Jekyll and Hyde, and that's the longest text of the semester. And as you know, as I've indicated, you want to try to read as much as you can so that ultimately when we get to that particular text, you've got a sense of it in its entirety. But the writings that you would have to do on the text for journals wouldn't be due until after we've put some conclusion on that particular text. So, and then of course there are always attendance questions that encourage you to think about the text as you're going through the text. So definitely if you haven't already done so, you should finish with Edgar Allan Poe's 4 short stories and begin Jekyll and Hyde and see how far you can get by Wednesday on the 7th. In the meantime, what I wanted to talk a little bit about, oh, and by the way, I included a link to Jekyll and Hyde as well. If you don't have access to that text, that's in our notes. But again, I'm sure you could find a Jekyll and Hyde link on your own if you wanted to. But this is from Project Gutenberg, which is a project to try to digitize as many classic texts as possible so that there is a sense of historical record. And it's turned out to be very useful, particularly during these challenging times. But at any rate, I wanted to talk a little bit about writing papers, and my suspicion is that you've already talked about this in other English classes, so this is just review. As I indicated, I have a handout entitled The Critical Paper, which is what you are going to be writing, included in the syllabus and other documents folder. To be quite honest, this was a handout that was given to me in my undergraduate years, and I've saved all this time, and I think it does a really nice job of reviewing how to go about the process of writing a paper. And as I've indicated very briefly, there are 3 pieces: the planning stage, the writing stage, and the editing stage. I can tell you right now that most writers skip the planning stage and they try to go directly to the writing stage, and they suffer as a result of it. That usually it's much more time effective if you don't begin by writing, but you begin by thinking and considering ideas. What might you write about? What text? What author? What sort of thesis might you be pursuing? Understanding that the thesis or the main point of your paper could be something that you discover as you are writing. So the thesis is something that can actually evolve. That said, the thesis is usually put in the introductory paragraph. So it's something that the reader experiences early on, but that doesn't mean to say that you have to write it early on. You can always plug in that thesis after the fact to that opening paragraph after you've done some initial writing phase, and that's the phase where you want to try to get your ideas down into sentences, and they don't need to be perfectly grammatically correct. What you're trying to do is to formulate some paragraphs and sentences and get a sense of organization and connection, because it's the editing phase, which again most writers skip, either because they've run out of time or they've run out of energy or they've run out of both. And the editing phase is when you can go through it sentence by sentence and try to perfect those sentences as much as possible. Or as a wise teacher of mine once said, a paper's never really done. You just have to hand it in at some point. So you can go through the editing phase and spend months, if not years, trying to perfect the writing. Obviously, we don't have that kind of luxury of time. So what you want to do is the best you can with the time you've got. And then remember that your first paper can be rewritten for a higher grade once I've evaluated it and I've put my comments on it. So you can always hand in papers early. You can always send me drafts and get some commentary from me. And as I said, your first paper isn't going to be due until approximately midway through the semester. So you've got some choices about whether or not you wanted to write on Frankenstein or perhaps Edgar Allan Poe or perhaps Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Even Dracula might be a possibility, but Dracula sort of straddles the beginning and the ending of the semester. So you might feel more comfortable writing about Dracula for paper number 2, which is going to be similar to paper number 1. They're both critical papers. In other words, you're not using outside sources. However, if you did want to write a research paper, I'm not necessarily against it. Just come talk with me, because you want to be able to do more than just gather the information about what other people have said in terms of the meaning of a text. but you also want to contribute your own original observations. So in some ways, it's a bit more challenging. When you're writing a critical paper, you're relying on your own analytic ability, what you've been able to do with what we've discussed in class and with your own understanding of the text itself. And of course, as I've suggested, reading the comments of your classmates can really help you get a much more in-depth sense of the text as whole, because this is what we would have probably discussed if we were in person. So, in terms of the introductory paragraph, in addition to your thesis, this is where you add the name of the author, or authors if you're writing on more than one author. And this is where you also add the name of the text, or text if you're writing on more than one text. So it's very clear to the reader what it is your paper is going to be about and which text you are analyzing. The body paragraphs of your paper, and notice I said paragraphs, more than one. The body paragraphs are where you give your evidence, your details, your arguments. And this is where you also add quotation and paraphrase. Quotation is an exact word-for-word retelling for something in the text, and you would use quotation marks, that piece of punctuation, to indicate that's what you're doing. A paraphrase is when you're using your own words to explain something within a particular text. And then finally, you've got a conclusion or a concluding paragraph, and this is where you give a sense of closure or ending to your paper. And I'm thinking your paper should be approximately 4 to 5 pages long, but as long or short as it needs to be, double-spaced, 1-inch margin. That's pretty much conventional in terms of academic writing. And in terms of a paragraph, the structure of a paragraph is that a paragraph should be minimum 3 sentences, probably much longer than that, but you need to have at minimum a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that first sentence is called the topic sentence in your paragraph, and it usually summarizes what your paragraph is about, which means what you should be able to do when you're done reading your paper, or when you're done writing your paper, is read your paper and read just the first paragraphs, and what you should get is a kind of skeletal outline. And that also works when you're reading textbooks and things of that nature. If they're well written, you can oftentimes rely on the first paragraphs or the first sentences of each of the paragraphs to serve as a kind of outline. Now, a sentence, since I had indicated that you need to have 3 or more sentences within a paragraph, a sentence basically expresses a complete thought or a complete idea. It should be able to stand on its own. It doesn't need to be reliant upon the previous or the following sentences so that it makes sense. This is where we start talking about what the elements of a sentence are, that you have to have a verb and action, and you need to have a subject, which happens to be a noun of who or what is engaged in the action. And it needs to express a complete thought. It needs to basically, again, be able to stand on its own. Punctuation, which is oftentimes the bane of many writers, understand that the point of punctuation is merely to clarify meaning. There are many things that we do vocally that help to express our meaning that are lost in the translation when we're writing. If you want to think about just very simple pieces of punctuation, like a period as opposed to an exclamation point, as opposed to a comma. And if you were to take a very simple sentence like sit down, there's a difference between saying sit down, which is a question with a question mark, sit down, which is the exclamation with the exclamation point, or sit down, which is the statement with the period. And more often than not, we use periods. Commas are pauses. And there are oftentimes places where we naturally take pauses in conversation so that we can briefly get some air or to emphasize a particular point. Semicolons are used to separate 2 complete sentences, 2 complete ideas that are very closely related to one another. So it can substitute for the period, but you want to make sure that in between those 2 sentences, you are justified in using a semicolon instead of a period. Because if you're using a period, the 2 sentences probably are closely related on some level. They're next to one another. But if there is a direct correlation between the 2, and you want to show that correlation, that's a semicolon. And the semicolon is a piece of punctuation that you're supposed to use sparingly for dramatic effect, almost like the exclamation point. So, in terms of what we are doing with documentation, because you need to quote from the text in order to be able to support your arguments, as well as paraphrase, put in your own language what's happening in the text. We are using the MLA system of parenthetical documentation. MLA stands for Modern Language Association. Basically, it's a system in which you use parentheses immediately following a quotation. And within those parentheses, you indicate some information about where that quote appeared. So within those parentheses, for instance, you might include the page number or the page numbers. And in that particular instance, you wouldn't need to worry about adding any words or letters. You don't have to say the word page or PG or anything. You would just add the number itself. And then you would close your parentheses and either continue on with your sentence or end your sentence at that particular point. That said, I know that there are other systems of documentation based on different disciplines. So you might be familiar, for instance, with systems that are used in the sciences, such as the APA or the American Psychological Association. But for the humanities and languages, we use the MLA, the Modern Language Association. And this is a system that you don't really memorize, you just look up how to go about documenting. There are lots of different ways to find it. If you haven't heard of Purdue OWL, and I will include this link, they are a wonderful source in terms of just the process of writing. They're done through Purdue University, and it's an open access link, so you don't have to be a student or in any way affiliated with the university in order to access that. Our own library, the GCC library, has a section that's devoted just to documentation and how to use all of these different systems, including the MLA system. And again, my hope is that you've utilized this system before so that this makes sense what I'm saying to you. I try not to assume though, so if I'm going too quickly or if it doesn't make sense, there are certainly places where you can look it up or just contact me and I'll be happy to go through it more slowly and more carefully with you. The way the system works is that at the very ending of the paper, you have a works cited page, and those are literally the works that you have cited, the texts that you have quoted from, whether they be websites or books or magazine articles or whatever the case may be, all in a list in alphabetical order by author's last name. And there's specific elements that you're supposed to include. Something like, for instance, the publisher or the place of publication. And there's small differences based on the source that you might be citing. So it's slightly different citing a source from a newspaper as it would be from a magazine. Things are rather simple, though, in terms of our paper writing, in that you aren't using outside resources and you are relying only on the text itself for the textual analysis, which means, quite honestly, that you don't even have to include a works cited page. Because once you've indicated in your opening paragraph the name of the text and the name of the author, the assumption is that all of the references to that text and author are from what you've cited at the very opening paragraph, and you're not including any other resources. So it'd be easy to determine. That said, if you wanted to include a works cited page, you certainly can. That would be the technically correct way to go about doing that. But you do want to make sure that you're formatting it correctly. So again, you want to look it up in the MLA system. It's reverse indentation, for instance, which means the first line goes out from one end to the margin to the other. And then if there's a second line within that entry, it's indented inwards. Note that we do the exact opposite with paragraphs. We indent in the first line and then all of the other lines come out. So that's what reverse indentation is. So you want to make sure you're using the correct formatting. Once you start using any outside text, outside of the actual book or reference that you've cited in your opening, then you do need to have a works cited page, because then the reader wouldn't be familiar with all of the sources that you're using. Yet another reason why I prefer that you write a critical paper rather than a research paper. So in terms of the handout that I had included, as I indicated, it's divided up into 3 pieces. The planning stage, and talking about that your goal is not to summarize the text. It's not to give a book report or a plot summary. Assume the reader has some familiarity with the text. You're analyzing or you're interpreting. Begin with a strong and specific thesis, something that implies some sort of interpretive conclusions about the work in the first paragraph. So you couldn't say something like, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. That's so general that that would apply to all authors and all texts. Or even saying something like, Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet. It is also so broad. We could say that about every author and every text. The question is what imagery is employed and how and why is it significant. Again, talking about the topic sentence, the first sentence of each paragraph, that gives a summary of the paragraph, and ideally it's founded upon an idea, not an event. Support each point in your argument with analysis, reference to the text, and some direct quotation where appropriate, but do not allow the evidence to take control of the paper. It is, by definition, supporting material. And basically, the idea is that you want to avoid the extremes. The extremes are no quotation whatsoever, and that wouldn't work. You need to have quotation as your evidence. But you don't want to add in quotation merely for length. So when I say approximately 4 to 5 pages for length, I mean approximately. Your paper should be as long as it needs to be. And oftentimes what people end up doing is they add a lot of quotation or a lot of unnecessary language to give them length. And that's not what teachers mean when they talk about length. When they talk about length, they're talking about ideas. What oftentimes happens is that what students hear is the number of words when we're talking about length. And in fact, it wouldn't at all be unusual for me to go through your writing and actually to delete some phrases or words, either because they're repetitious or because they're wordy. They're just not necessary in terms of the actual writing itself. But I'm still at the beginning of our handout under the planning stage about finding an interesting way to conclude. Remember that a conclusion has to be a well-developed paragraph, 3 or more paragraphs. And I know that oftentimes at the conclusion people are tired and have run out of time, so you want to save a little bit of energy. Perhaps you could hint at a related idea, or perhaps you could connect what you're talking about to modern day. Those are some ways to conclude, though there are multiple ways, right down to just basically restating your thesis in different language, of course. So the writing section. The first principle, I'm reading this to you directly from the handout. The first principle of good writing is economy. The second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. And that's what I meant by saying that I oftentimes go through papers and I delete language that just isn't necessary in order to forward a particular thought. Better to be more concise and have less writing than to have more writing that could have been written in a more concise fashion, generally speaking. Vary your sentences. You should have some short ones. You should have some long ones. You don't want to have all of them be very short because then your paper sounds simplistic, or very long because then your paper can be very dense. Avoid cliches and trite expressions, overused expressions that no longer have any original meaning to them, dead as a doornail, raining cats and dogs, things of that nature, because they can be misunderstood. I usually talk a little bit about second language learners and how difficult it is for them to learn the language rather than them having to learn all of these expressions that may not necessarily be sensical on the surface. But you may have heard of a story, this was about 25 years ago or so, that actually somebody was shot and killed over a misunderstanding of language. The person was told to basically freeze. And the second language learner either misunderstood or misheard and instead continued moving, and he was shot dead. And it's a terribly tragic tale to illustrate how language can be misunderstood and how important it is to try to be as universal as possible in your writing. And that's usually why we have these rules, such as avoiding cliches, trite expressions, avoid slang, informal language that basically has been created so that another group doesn't understand it. Sometimes it does go mainstream, so when I say somebody's a cool person, cool is slang in this respect, but you probably know that I'm saying something positive about that individual. I'm not necessarily talking about their temperature, even though technically cool is related to temperature. So you get the idea. In terms of literature, always keep in the present tense. The idea is that the piece of literature is happening in the here and now. That's what makes it timeless and universal. So when you are talking about these pieces, talk about them as if they are happening, not as if they've already happened. A personal pet peeve of mine happens to be contractions. If you don't know what a contraction is, this way you take two words and you contract them into one. So you take a word such as do and you take another word such as not. If you contract them together, it's don't. And this is very common in our language, but that's considered fairly informal. So I suggest that you avoid that and say do not in your writing. If you end up writing a contraction, it certainly isn't going to impact your grade negatively, but I will make note of it because I am a traditionalist, or at least this is the way that I was schooled, in a traditional fashion. And then in the last piece of the handout, it talks about proofreading, and you definitely want to make sure that you're rereading your work. Try reading it out loud. You can oftentimes hear errors. Try reading it backwards. If you were to read it from the end to the beginning, you might be more likely to catch errors. You do need to have a title. Your title should be original. It shouldn't be the name of the text itself. So you don't want to call your paper Frankenstein, but you could use part of the title of the text within your own title. So you could talk about something like life and death in Frankenstein. If you're curious, by the way, short stories are usually put in quotation marks, and novels and dramas are usually underlined or italicized. That's the convention. When you read through the handout above, you can see how very old this handout is, because it says that instructors prefer typewritten papers. Obviously, it's got to be typed. You can send it to me via PDF to my email so that I can return it back to you. Technically, there should be a title page, which is a separate sheet that just basically includes your name and contact information. And considering where we are now and submitting everything electronically, just as long as I can see who is the author and what your title is, that would suffice at that point if you're trying to save yourself a few keystrokes. The paper's due on the date assigned, but if you can't make that date, ask for an extension. I'll be happy to give it to you. So that gives you just a little bit of an overview about paper writing. I hope I didn't go too quickly, and I hope I didn't go too slowly. If you've heard this before, I apologize, but I wanted to make sure that everybody was generally on the same page. And we'll talk more about writing papers as the semester progresses. But at this point, we've put some closure onto Frankenstein, and we are moving forward with talking about Edgar Allan Poe. So today's attendance question happens to be about the Poe short stories, the 4 that I had assigned. And my question is, which Poe short story did you like the best? Was it The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, or The Black Cat? And why? Again, no right or wrong answer, but I thought this might be a way that we could begin our conversation about Poe next class. So I hope you're well, I'm well, and we'll continue on with Poe. Take care.